A Navy SEAL leads his dog north, searching for peace after injuries and the weight of war. The dog suddenly stops, refusing to move on, because what he senses beneath the mountain is something no mission ever prepared them for. They step into an underground world built on balance, restraint, and a promise the modern world has forgotten. What follows is not a battle of weapons, but a cold collision between loyalty and greed. One choice keeps the mountain standing. One decision demands a price too great to imagine. This is not a story about victory. It is a story about the cost of doing what is right. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. Like and subscribe. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter. Now, let's begin. Rowan Hale arrived in the North without ceremony. No farewell texts, no last look in the rearview mirror. He crossed the county line just after dawn, when the sky was a pale, rinsed blue, and the road still held the memory of frost. The kind of morning that didn't ask questions. It simply existed, clean and cold, as if the world had been reset overnight and forgotten to tell anyone. He drove with both hands on the wheel, shoulders squared, posture unchanged by the miles. At 35, Rowan moved like a man whose body still remembered commands even when his mind no longer issued them. He was tall, just over 6 feet, lean in the way that came from use rather than display. His face was clean-shaven, the skin pale but weathered, kissed rough by northern wind. A square jaw held firm lines, while cheekbones cut clean beneath skin that had known too many winters outdoors. His hair, dark brown and cropped close in a military cut grown a fraction longer than regulation, lay flat beneath a knit cap he didn't bother adjusting. His eyes, gray-blue, steady watched the road without judgment. They were the eyes of someone who had seen enough not to flinch, and enough not to romanticize. Beside him sat Brim. The German shepherd took up the passenger seat with quiet authority. 5 years old, large but not bulky, his coat blended shades of cream, ash gray, and black darker along the spine and ears, lighter at the chest and muzzle. His amber eyes stayed alert, tracking motion outside the window with restrained interest. He wore a black working harness edged in a muted dark red trim, the color catching the light when the sun slipped between trees. No tags jingled, no unnecessary weight. So Brim had learned early that silence mattered. Rowan glanced at him once, briefly, then returned his gaze to the road. "Almost there," he said. Brim didn't respond. He never did unless it mattered. The cabin sat where the forest began to forget itself. It was small, weathered cedar tucked against a rise of stone and pine, its porch facing a frozen stretch of lake that reflected the sky like polished steel. Rowan parked, killed the engine, and listened as the ticking metal faded into quiet. The air smelled of sap and thawing earth. Somewhere distant, ice cracked with a sound like a rifle shot, then settled again. He stepped out, boots crunching on gravel, and stretched once controlled, economical. The tactical combat shirt he wore, olive gray and softened by years of washing, pulled slightly at the shoulders. Beneath it, a darker red thermal layer peeked at the collar when he bent to grab his pack. His combat pants were old, brown-green, the knees scuffed thin, pockets sagging with familiarity, as the boots were scarred. The watch on his wrist bore a spiderweb of scratches across its face. All of it was intentional in its neglect. Nothing here was new. Nothing here was pretending. Brim jumped down and circled the clearing once, nose low, tail steady. He paused near the edge of the trees, head angled slightly as if listening, then returned to Rowan's side. "Clear," Rowan murmured. The word was habit. The meaning had shifted. Inside, the cabin held the smell of dust and cold wood. Rowan set his pack down, opened the shutters, and let the light in. It spilled across the floor in a pale wash, illuminating a simple table, 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove. No photographs, no reminders. Exactly as advertised. He didn't unpack much. He never did. Outside again, Rowan followed a narrow path toward the lake. The surface was mostly frozen, but meltwater pooled along the edges, catching sunlight in fractured patterns. At the forest around him stood tall and quiet pine and fir rising like columns, their branches whispering to one another in the breeze. Brim walked a step ahead now, gait measured, paws placing carefully. This wasn't play. It never was. They reached a low stretch of land where a narrow stream cut through stone, the water clear and fast from snowmelt. Moss clung thick to the rocks, deep green against gray. Rowan slowed, appreciating the sound, the way it softened the edges inside his head. Then Brim stopped. Not abruptly, not with alarm. He simply stepped in front of Rowan and stood still. Rowan halted, instinct kicking in before thought. He waited, scanning. The forest looked unchanged. No movement, no sound beyond water and wind. "Brim," he said quietly. The dog didn't look back. His ears pricked forward, nose angled toward a patch of moss-covered stone near the stream. His body was rigid, not tense, but focused, as if the world had narrowed to a single point beneath his paws. Rowan felt it then, not danger exactly, but wrongness. Was a subtle shift, like air pressure before a storm. He crouched, hand brushing the moss. Cold seeped through his glove. Beneath it, stone felt smoother than it should have. Straighter. Too straight. Rowan's breath slowed. His pulse did not quicken, but something older stirred in his chest. A memory of moments when the map had lied, and survival depended on listening to what wasn't being said. "What do you hear?" he asked. Brim remained still. For a moment, just a moment, Rowan thought he felt warmth rising faintly through the rock. Not heat, but balance. Controlled. Maintained. Then Brim stepped back and sat. Rowan froze. Brim did not sit unless ordered, or unless something demanded respect. The sound came then, not loud, not clear, a low vibration, almost imagined, as if the earth beneath them had exhaled. Rowan straightened slowly, eyes never leaving the stone. The forest felt different now, not hostile, aware. He marked the spot with his gaze, committing every detail to memory, the angle of the stream, a crooked birch leaning left, a scar in the rock shaped like an arrowhead. Training layered over intuition, both agreeing on the same command. Not yet. Rowan rose and stepped back. Brim followed, casting one last look at the stone before turning away. Whatever lay beneath that patch of moss, it wasn't forgotten. It was waiting. The town was small and honest in its quiet. Rowan stopped there the next morning for supplies. A general store, a diner with fogged windows, a single gas pump that looked older than him. He moved through it without drawing attention, the way he always had. At the counter of the diner stood a woman in a ranger's jacket, forest green with a patch stitched neatly at the shoulder. She was in her early 30s, average height, build practical rather than delicate. Dark blonde hair was pulled into a low tie beneath her cap, a few loose strands escaping around her temples. Her skin held the faint burn of someone who spent more time outdoors than under lights. When she turned, her eyes, hazel, sharp assessed Rowan quickly, then softened a fraction. "You knew?" she asked, not unkindly. "Passing through," Rowan said. She nodded, accepting the half-truth. "I'm Marin, Forest Service." "Rowan." Her gaze dropped briefly to Brim, who sat at his heel, calm and unmoving. Something in her expression shifted respect, maybe. "Working dog?" she asked. "Was," Rowan replied. "Once a ranger, always a ranger," she said lightly, then paused. "Same with dogs." Rowan almost smiled. They didn't talk much after that. Didn't need to. She warned him about thin ice near the eastern shore, about private land markers farther north. Practical things. Boundaries. Rowan listened. As he left, Marin watched him go, eyes narrowing slightly, not suspicious, just thoughtful. People like Rowan carried their past the way some landscapes carried fault lines, invisible until pressure revealed them. Outside, Brim paused, head turning toward the forest. Rowan followed his gaze. The trees stood quiet, sunlight threading between them like something deliberate. "Later," Rowan murmured, not sure to whom he was speaking. That evening, back at the cabin, Rowan sat on the porch with a mug cooling in his hands. The lake reflected the sky in muted golds and blues. The world felt suspended, held between seasons. Brim lay at his feet, body angled toward the trees rather than the open water. Rowan studied the dog's breathing slow, even. He thought of the stone by the stream, of the way the earth had felt alive beneath his hand. He had come north to forget, to be small, to let the noise inside him quiet. Instead, something had noticed him. Rowan closed his eyes, feeling the cold seep into his bones, grounding him. He didn't pray. He didn't make promises. He simply listened. And somewhere beneath moss and stone, something listened back. Morning in the north did not arrive gently. It asserted itself. Rowan woke before the light fully cleared the trees, the way he always did, eyes open, body still, breath already measured. For a few seconds he lay on the narrow bed in the cabin, listening. Not to sounds exactly, but to the absence of them. No engines, no distant traffic. Just the low creak of cooling wood and the faint hiss of wind brushing needles together. At the foot of the bed, Brim lay stretched on his side, but not asleep. One amber eye was open, tracking Rowan without moving his head. The dog's ears flicked once, then settled. "You too," Rowan murmured. Brim's tail gave a single, restrained thump against the floor. Not excitement. Acknowledgement. Rowan sat up and swung his legs over the side of the bed. The cold bit immediately through the cabin air, warm sharp enough to clear the last traces of sleep. He pulled on his boots, laced them with practiced speed, and shrugged into the same worn layers from the day before. The tactical shirt still held the faint smell of pine smoke from last night's stove fire. Familiar. Grounding. Outside, the lake had changed overnight. Where yesterday it had been steel blue and solid, thin seams of dark water now traced the shoreline like veins. Melt was accelerating. The season was shifting, whether anyone was ready or not. Rowan stepped onto the porch with a mug of coffee and stood there a moment, letting the cold settle into his bones. Brim followed, positioning himself slightly behind and to the left, old habit from a different life. His body was relaxed, but his attention wasn't. Rowan noticed that. "You're watching something," he said quietly. Brim's gaze was fixed not on the lake, but toward the tree line beyond the cabin, where the forest thickened and the ground rose subtly toward stone. And Rowan felt it again, that faint internal pressure, like a question pressing against the inside of his ribs. He finished his coffee, set the mug down, and grabbed his pack. They headed out just after sunrise. Rowan didn't bring much water, a small first aid kit, headlamp, map folded and refolded until the creases were soft as cloth. He told himself it was a hike, a routine sweep of the area, nothing more. The forest accepted them without comment. Light filtered down in narrow shafts, catching on frost still clinging to shaded needles. The ground was uneven, a patchwork of damp earth, old snow, and exposed rock. Rowan moved easily, weight balanced, steps deliberate. He'd learned long ago how to walk without arguing with the land. Brim ranged a little wider today, nose low, movements fluid but intent. He wasn't tracking in the traditional sense. There was no urgency, no zigzagging excitement. It was something else like listening with his whole body. Rowan followed the familiar route toward the stream, keeping the lake to his right until the terrain shifted and the trees thinned. He checked the map once, more out of habit than necessity. Everything matched, until it didn't. Brim slowed first, not abruptly, just enough that Rowan felt the change through the leashless space between them. The dog's head lifted slightly, ears forward, stride shortening. Then Brim veered left. Rowan stopped. "Hold up," he said instinctively. Brim did not stop. He didn't accelerate either. He simply continued on the new heading, calm and unwavering, as if the decision had already been made and discussion was no longer relevant. Rowan exhaled slowly. The map said nothing about this direction. No trail, no marker. Just contour lines stacked close together, signaling a rise in elevation and stone beneath the soil. He followed. The forest here felt older, not in a mystical sense, but in a practical one. Trees spaced wider, trunks thicker, the ground more stubborn underfoot. Moss covered everything in deep, velvet layers, muffling sound. Even Rowan's boots seemed quieter here. They reached the stream again, farther upstream than before. The water cut a narrow, fast channel between rocks polished smooth by decades of melt and freeze. Rowan crouched to refill his bottle, the cold numbing his fingers. Brim did not drink. He stood rigid at the bank, body angled toward a section of stone just beyond the moss line. Rowan straightened slowly. "All right," he said under his breath. He approached the rock, careful now, senses sharpening. The stone was dark and damp, its surface irregular except where it wasn't. A narrow seam ran through it, nearly invisible unless you were looking for the wrong thing. Rowan pressed his gloved hand against the stone. Cold. Then beneath it, a subtle, steady warmth. Not heat. Regulation. His jaw tightened. This wasn't erosion. This wasn't chance. This was intent. He stepped back, scanning the area with new eyes. As the stream's path curved just enough to conceal the stone from casual view, the slope above was gentle, the kind that invited footsteps away rather than toward. Everything about the place suggested avoidance without warning. Brim sat. Not because he was tired. Rowan felt the weight of that decision settle over him. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I see it." He didn't open anything. Didn't pry or dig. He marked the position in his mind the way he'd been trained angles, landmarks, the way the light fell at that hour. Some doors punished impatience. They turned back. The hike home felt longer, though Rowan couldn't say why. The forest hadn't changed. The air hadn't thickened. But something in him had shifted, like a compass needle refusing to settle. Back at the cabin, he set his pack down and sat at the small table, map spread out in front of him. He traced their route with a finger, noting where Brim had left the marked trail. "You don't do that," Rowan said, not accusing. Not without reason." Brim lay nearby, head on his paws, eyes open, watching, waiting. Rowan folded the map again. He went into town that afternoon, partly for supplies, partly because the cabin felt too small for the thoughts crowding it. The diner was busier than yesterday, a couple of loggers at one table, an older woman nursing a coffee by the window. Behind the counter stood a man Rowan hadn't seen before. He was in his late 60s, broad-shouldered despite his age, with a gray beard that looked more functional than styled. His hands were thick, knuckles scarred, the hands of someone who fixed things because they needed fixing. "You're the guy with the dog," the man said as Rowan approached. "That obvious?" Rowan replied. The man grinned. "Around here, yeah. Name's Duke." "Hail." Duke poured coffee without asking. "You staying long?" Rowan shrugged. "Depends." Duke nodded like that was answer enough. Place has a way of deciding that for people." Rowan studied him easy manner, sharp eyes, someone who'd seen enough winters to know when not to push. "Your dog," Duke added, glancing toward Brim. "He's not just walking with you, is he?" Rowan didn't answer right away. "No," he said finally. "He's leading." Duke's smile faded, just a touch. "Then you might want to listen." That night, Rowan woke to Brim standing at the foot of the bed. Not pacing, not whining, just standing there, perfectly still. Rowan sat up, heart steady but alert. "What is it?" Brim turned his head toward the window. Outside, the forest lay under a thin wash of moonlight. Everything looked ordinary trees, snow, shadow. Then Rowan heard it. A low, distant hum, almost imagined. Too consistent to be wind, too deep to be water. It wasn't loud enough to alarm. It was loud enough to be noticed. Rowan swung his legs off the bed, every sense awake now. He reached for his boots, then paused. The sound faded. Silence returned, heavier than before. Brim sat. Rowan stayed where he was, breath slow, listening long after the night offered nothing else. Whatever lay beneath the forest wasn't just hidden. It was active. The next morning came bright and cold, as if nothing had happened. Rowan stood outside the cabin, scanning the tree line. The lake reflected sunlight cleanly. Birds moved through branches. Life went on, unbothered by questions. Brim resumed his normal behavior, alert, calm, responsive. If not for the night before, Rowan might have convinced himself he'd imagined the sound. He didn't believe that. Rowan checked his gear, methodically, as if preparing for something he couldn't yet name. He wasn't afraid. Fear required clarity. What he felt instead was responsibility creeping in around the edges. He had come north to be alone, to let the noise inside him quiet. Instead, the land had spoken softly, deliberately, and his dog had heard it first. Rowan looked down at Brim. "You don't choose easy paths, do you?" he asked. Brim's ears flicked. His gaze returned to the forest. Rowan followed it, and for the first time in years, he didn't turn away. Rowan did not return to the stone that morning. That restraint surprised him. He woke early, as usual, and went through the small rituals that gave shape to his days. Boots laced, Kettle set. Brim fed before himself. Outside, the forest stood bright and indifferent, sunlight catching on frost and meltwater alike. Nothing looked disturbed. Nothing looked inviting. Still, the awareness from the previous night lingered. Not fear, not urgency, but the quiet certainty that something had already been set in motion, whether he chose to acknowledge it or not. Brim ate without hesitation, then sat near the door, posture upright, waiting. Rowan watched him for a long moment. The German shepherd's coat caught the light in layered tones cream along the chest, ash gray fading into black across his back. His body was relaxed, but the set of his shoulders carried intention. 5 years old, fully grown, fully trained, yet still guided by something older than command. "You're not letting this go," Rowan said. Brim's ears flicked, that was all. Rowan exhaled slowly, then nodded once to himself, to the choice forming quietly in his chest. He checked his pack again, more carefully this time. Rope, headlamp, extra batteries, chalk. Not because he expected to need them, but because experience had taught him that denial did not prevent consequence. They left the cabin mid-morning, following the same route as before, until the forest subtly shifted. Rowan recognized the landmarks now, without effort. The birch bent like a broken finger, the narrow stream's turn, the patch of moss that swallowed sound. Brim slowed as they approached the stone. Rowan stopped him with a raised hand, not in command, but in acknowledgement. "All right, together." He knelt and brushed the moss aside more deliberately than before, as the seam revealed itself again, precise and unweathered. The warmth beneath the rock felt steadier now, less like a suggestion and more like confirmation. Rowan adjusted his headlamp, took a breath, and applied pressure along the seam. The stone did not resist. It yielded. Not with a grinding protest or dramatic shift, but with a measured, controlled movement, sliding inward just enough to reveal darkness beyond. Cool air brushed Rowan's face, carrying a scent that did not belong to caves or decay. Clean stone, a faint trace of metal. "Someone built this," Rowan murmured. Brim stepped forward without hesitation. The passage sloped downward gently, reinforced with old timber supports darkened by age but still sound. Iron brackets held the beams in place, hand-forged, not machined. Rowan recognized the craftsmanship instantly. Careful, methodical, born from planning rather than panic. They moved slowly. Rowan counted steps, marked turns with chalk. The temperature stabilized within moments, settling into an even cool that reminded him of underground facilities he'd worked in long ago, bunkers meant to outlast conflict, spaces designed for endurance. After nearly 20 minutes, the tunnel widened. Rowan stopped short. The headlamp's beam stretched outward, swallowed by scale. The passage opened into a cavern so vast it disrupted his sense of proportion. This was no natural chamber left untouched. Stone walls had been shaped, reinforced, terraced. Wooden walkways crossed open space with deliberate geometry. Lantern brackets lined the walls at even intervals. And beyond them, buildings. Rowan stood motionless as the truth assembled itself piece by piece. Small structures carved into the rock, storage sheds, workshops, homes. Paths curved gently around a central open area, wide enough to gather dozens at once. An underground settlement. Not ruined, not collapsed, preserved. "This isn't possible," Rowan whispered, though no one was there to hear it. Brim moved forward first, paws echoing softly on packed earth. He didn't dart or sniff wildly. He walked as if following memory rather than instinct. Rowan followed, pulse steady but heavy. Dust lay thin and even across surfaces, undisturbed by footsteps for years, perhaps decades. Doors remained closed. Windows shuttered. Nothing here suggested haste or fear. This place had not been abandoned. It had been left. At the center of the square, Brim stopped and sat. Rowan's throat tightened unexpectedly. The gesture was not defensive. It was patient. As if the dog understood the weight of what they were standing inside. Rowan lowered his pack and took a slow turn, absorbing detail. Symbols carved into the surrounding rock repeated in subtle variations, lines and arcs, functional rather than decorative. Not religious, not military, communal. He felt intrusive, like a man walking into a memory that didn't belong to him. He approached the nearest structure and tested the door. As it opened with a quiet groan, hinges stiff, but intact. Inside, the air was cooler still. A single-room dwelling. Wooden table, shelves, a narrow bed with a folded blanket wrapped carefully in waxed cloth. No mold. No rot. Someone had loved this space enough to prepare it for absence. Rowan closed the door gently and moved on. They explored slowly, methodically. A workshop with tools hung neatly on walls, handles polished by long use. A chalkboard bore faint markings measurements. Perhaps lessons interrupted, but not erased. A small room with low benches suggested schooling. Rowan lingered there longer than he meant to, imagining voices that once filled the space. Brim waited at doorways, respectful in a way that felt almost human. Hours passed unnoticed until Rowan's watch reminded him of time. Supplies were finite. He needed to decide. He chose a small house near the edge of the cavern and laid out his sleeping gear. Brim circled once, and then settled near the doorway facing inward, guarding the village rather than the dark beyond. As Rowan ate quietly, the weight of the place pressed against him, not threatening, but insistent. He touched the scratched face of his watch, grounding himself. Then Brim rose. The dog moved to the far wall of the house, head tilted, ears sharply forward. A low sound left his throat. Not a growl, not a whine. Something between. Rowan stood immediately. "What is it?" Brim stared at a section of stone etched with deeper symbols than the others. His breathing slowed. He raised one paw, hesitated, then placed it down. The stone responded not with noise, but with motion. A subtle vibration passed through the floor, barely perceptible but undeniable. The symbols caught the lantern light differently now, shadows aligning into something new. A doorway, perfectly concealed. Rowan's heart pounded, not in panic, but recognition. This place was layered, built with safeguards, designed to reveal itself only under specific conditions. Brim looked back at him, eyes steady, waiting. Rowan did not open the door. Some thresholds demanded patience. That night, lying on the narrow bed, Rowan stared up at the rough-hewn ceiling and felt something he hadn't allowed himself in years. Trust. Not in the place. Not in the mechanisms. In the dog lying alert by the doorway. Brim's presence filled the small space, quiet and absolute. Whatever this village was, It had not called to Rowan. It had answered Brim, and that unsettled him more than any hidden door. Morning came without dawn. There was no gradual softening of darkness underground, no shift of color to mark time's passage. Rowan woke to stillness deep and complete. For a moment he didn't know where he was. Then memory returned in fragments. Stone walls, carved paths, the weight of history. He rose carefully, unwilling to disturb anything that didn't belong to him. But the folded blanket remained untouched at the foot of the bed. Outside, the village revealed itself again, unchanged. Paths curved gently between buildings, edges worn smooth by hands long gone. The cavern ceiling disappeared into shadow so high it defied scale. What struck Rowan most was not what was present, but what wasn't. No collapse, no desperation, no signs of failure. This place hadn't died. It had paused. Rowan began to map the area as best he could, marking ventilation shafts disguised as stone seams, tracking water channels that fed into a central cistern. The engineering was elegant, redundant systems, fail-safes built by people who understood that survival wasn't about strength. It was about balance. By midday, unease crept in, not fear, but pressure. The longer he stayed, the more the village felt less like a discovery and more like a responsibility he hadn't asked for. Brim stopped in the center of the square and looked at him. Not pleading, not commanding, expectant. Rowan sighed softly. "I know," he said. He packed his notes away and sat on a stone bench, letting the silence settle around him. He thought of the men he'd known who had disappeared after war, not missing. Just gone. Men who couldn't reconcile who they were with, who the world expected them to be. Was this where people like that ended up? The question lingered unanswered. Rowan rose at last, checking his gear. He would return to the surface soon. Not to abandon this place, but to understand it. As they moved toward the tunnel, Brim paused and glanced back at the village once. Not farewell. Vigilance. Rowan returned to the surface before noon. The climb back through the tunnel felt longer than the descent, not because of distance, but because the air changed with every step upward. The steady, even calm of the underground settlement gave way to wind and weather, to a world that moved too fast and asked too many questions. When he emerged from the stone seam and slid the rock back into place, the forest closed around the spot as if nothing had ever happened. That unsettled him more than the discovery itself. Brim shook once, resetting his coat, then stood still. His ears angled toward the trees uphill, then toward the open forest beyond. He looked, briefly, like a sentry caught between two borders. Rowan brushed the moss back into place with careful hands. He left no markers this time, no chalk, no signs, or whatever lived beneath the stone had chosen restraint. He owed it the same. They hiked back toward the cabin in silence. The lake had broken further while they were gone. Long black ribbons of water cut through the ice, glinting in the pale sun. Rowan paused at the shoreline, watching a section fracture and drift. He felt the parallel too easily, pressure accumulating, structures holding until they didn't. He had just set his pack down inside the cabin when his phone vibrated. The signal was thin, unreliable. He almost ignored it. Almost. A voicemail notification blinked on the screen. No missed calls. No text. Rowan listened. "Mr. Hale," a man's voice said, measured, confident, perfectly unhurried. "This is Gideon Price. I believe we have a mutual interest in the land north of your current residence. I'd appreciate a brief conversation at your convenience. I'll be in town this afternoon." The message ended without a callback number. Rowan stared at the phone for a moment, and then set it face down on the table. Brim lifted his head. "You heard that too?" Rowan asked quietly. The dog's tail did not move. The meeting happened at the edge of town, in a converted lodge that now served as a temporary office for visiting investors. Rowan recognized the place from Marin's earlier warnings, neutral ground, technically public, with windows that faced the water and made everything look clean. Gideon Price stood near the windows when Rowan arrived. He was in his late 40s, perhaps 50, tall enough to command attention without needing to raise his voice. His suit was dark and perfectly fitted, his overcoat a tailored charcoal wool that looked expensive without advertising the fact. His hair was neatly combed back, silver just beginning to thread through the black. Clean-shaven, no wasted motion. When he turned, his smile arrived a half-second before his eyes. "Mr. Hale," Gideon said, extending a hand. "I'm glad you came." Rowan did not shake it. Gideon didn't seem to notice. He gestured toward a chair instead. "Please." Rowan remained standing. Gideon studied him then, not rudely, but thoroughly. He took in the worn clothing, the old boots, the posture that spoke of habit rather than comfort. His gaze flicked briefly to Brim, who sat at Rowan's heel, still and silent. "Impressive animal," Gideon said. "German Shepherd?" Rowan said nothing. Gideon smiled again, unfazed. "I represent Price Meridian Energy. We're conducting preliminary assessments in the region. Geothermal potential. Clean, sustainable, profitable." He let the last word land without apology. "Your cabin sits within a corridor we're very interested in acquiring." Rowan folded his arms. "I don't own the land," he said. Gideon nodded. "No, but you're adjacent to it, and people like you tend to notice things others don't." He leaned back against the desk, crossing his ankles. "Thermal irregularities, subsurface airflow, minor signal interference." Rowan's expression didn't change. Gideon watched him closely. "I'm offering you an opportunity to be on the right side of an inevitable process." Rowan thought of the underground village, the care in its construction, the patience written into every beam and channel. "You should look somewhere else," he said. The temperature in the room shifted, not physically, but socially. Gideon's smile thinned, just slightly. "I don't think you understand how this works," he replied calmly. "No one loses here. Communities gain infrastructure. The state gains revenue. The environment benefits from reduced emissions." His eyes sharpened. "And individuals who cooperate are compensated generously." "And if they don't?" Rowan asked. Gideon's gaze flicked, just once, toward the window, toward the lake. "Then the process continues without them." Outside, Marin waited by her truck. She stood with her weight on one hip, and a ranger jacket zipped against the cold, her hair pulled back tight. When she saw Rowan emerge, her jaw tightened. "Tell me you didn't agree to anything," she said. "I didn't," Rowan replied. She exhaled sharply. "Good, because Price isn't here for a conversation. He's here to stake a claim." She explained as they walked about exploratory permits filed quietly, about survey teams contracted through third parties, about pressure already being applied to landowners upstream. "Who's backing him?" Rowan asked. Marin hesitated. "People with patience. And lawyers." That night, Rowan met the lawyers. Theo Calder arrived just after dusk, boots tracking snow into the cabin. He was in his early 40s, lean, with dark hair already thinning at the temples and a permanent crease between his brows. He wore a wool coat that had seen better years and carried a leather satchel scarred by use. "I don't usually take cases like this," Theo said, setting the bag down. Mostly zoning disputes, easements, ugly stuff that eats weekends." "Why now?" Rowan asked. Theo's mouth twitched. "Because I grew up here, and because Price Meridian doesn't lose." With him came Etta Wren. She was older, late 60s, perhaps short and sharp-eyed, with silver hair cut blunt at her jaw. She wore a heavy parka dusted with chalk and soil stains, and her gloves bore the wear of long field seasons. "A retired geologist," Marin explained. "Brilliant, stubborn, blacklisted once for refusing to sign off on a project she knew would poison a watershed." "They don't like people who won't compromise," Etta said cheerfully, glancing around the cabin. "I don't like people who pretend compromise means the same thing for everyone." They spread maps across the table topographic overlays, mineral assessments, property lines that twisted like legal traps. Theo spoke of injunctions and delays. Etta traced fault lines and aquifers with a pencil. Brim lay beneath the table, and head resting on his paws, eyes open. "This area here," Etta said, tapping the map near Rowan's cabin. "Natural insulation. Stone layers thick enough to trap heat. If Price drills, he won't just find energy, he'll destabilize everything." Rowan's jaw clenched. He said nothing about what lay beneath. As the conversation wound down, Brim rose abruptly. The movement was subtle, but decisive. He walked to the door and stood there, head angled, ears rigid. Not alarmed. Focused. Rowan followed his gaze. Outside, headlights swept briefly across the trees, too slow for traffic, too deliberate to be lost. The engine idled, distant but present. Rowan felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. They were already being watched. The days that followed tightened like a drawn wire. Survey flags appeared along ridgelines where none had been before. Marin was reassigned temporarily paperwork, they said. Theo fielded calls that ended abruptly. Etta's name surfaced in an internal memo questioning her objectivity. Gideon Price remained polite through it all. He sent emails thanking Rowan for his time. He donated to the town's school fund. He smiled for the local paper beside a banner that read, "Clean energy for a clean future." Rafe Kellen arrived with the survey team. He was younger than Gideon, mid-30s, with a shaved head and a beard kept short and precise. Broad-shouldered, athletic, his movements economical. He wore neutral outdoor gear without logos and spoke little, but his eyes missed nothing. When Rowan encountered him near the tree line, Rafe's gaze lingered on Brim with professional interest. "Good dog," Rafe said. Brim did not move. Rowan felt the threat in the space between them, unspoken, calculated. That night, Rowan walked the shoreline alone. Ice shifted and groaned under the moon. The world felt poised on the edge of something. He thought of Gideon's smile, of Rafe's quiet assessment, of the underground village waiting in patient darkness. For the first time since arriving in the north, Rowan understood the shape of the choice forming in front of him. Silence, he realized, was no longer neutral. Some quiet places survived only if someone was willing to stand between them, and the Price men were willing to pay. The first sign that something had gone wrong was not noise. It was stillness. Rowan felt it the moment he stepped outside the cabin at dawn, a tension in the air that did not belong to weather. The lake lay flat and dark, the ice retreating in long, slow fractures, but even the birds seemed hesitant. Their calls came late, scattered, as if the forest itself were listening before deciding whether to speak. Brim stood beside him, posture rigid. His ears were angled not toward the water or the trees, but toward the higher ground beyond the cabin, where survey flags had begun to multiply like a quiet disease. Rowan tightened the strap on his pack. "Something moved," he said, not as a question. Brim did not look at him. His tail was still, his weight balanced forward, ready. They followed the narrow trail that cut uphill toward the ridge. The flags were closer now, bright orange, plastic, obscene against stone and moss. Someone had driven stakes deeper into the ground overnight. The marks were fresh, intentional. Rowan crouched and examined one of the stakes. It vibrated faintly under his fingers, not from wind, but from something deeper. A low, persistent tremor. He straightened slowly. That was when he heard it. Not a sound exactly, more a pressure, a sense of imbalance pressing upward through his boots, the kind of feeling you got before a controlled detonation, when the earth seemed to brace itself. "Brim," Rowan said sharply. The dog was already moving. Brim took the lead, without hesitation, trotting down slope toward the stream, then angling hard left away from the surface signs of intrusion and toward the place Rowan had sworn not to revisit so soon. They moved fast now, not running, but purposeful. Rowan's breath stayed even, his mind narrowing into the clean focus he remembered from deployments. This wasn't fear. This was response. The stone seam revealed itself, as if the forest had decided to stop hiding it. Rowan slid the rock aside and followed Brim into the tunnel, sealing the entrance behind them with practiced speed. The air inside felt different than before, warmer, denser, moving in currents that didn't match the design he'd mapped. "Damn it," he muttered. They moved deeper, boots striking packed earth, headlamp cutting a steady beam through the passage. Rowan felt it now, subtle vibrations along the walls, irregular and wrong. Not a collapse. Not yet. Sabotage. Someone on the surface had begun drilling. Not properly. Not carefully. Enough to disrupt the underground system without triggering obvious alarms. Enough to force the place to respond. They reached the edge of the village faster this time. The open cavern greeted them not with silence, but with a low, almost inaudible hum, a system compensating under strain. Lantern brackets rattled faintly. Dust lifted from surfaces that had not been disturbed in decades. Rowan stopped in the central square and took a slow turn. The place was breathing harder. Brim moved ahead, paws silent, head low. He did not pause at the familiar paths or dwellings. Instead, he angled toward a narrower corridor, branching off the main cavern, one Rowan had marked, but not fully explored. "Wait," Rowan said instinctively. Brim did not. Rowan followed. The corridor sloped downward, the ceiling lowering just enough to force Rowan to duck. The air grew warmer here, laced with the metallic tang he now recognized as regulated heat, gone off balance. The vibration intensified, a pulse that traveled up through his legs. They emerged into a chamber Rowan had not seen before. It was functional rather than communal. No dwellings, no benches, just stone walls reinforced with older timber and a network of channels running along the floor and ceiling. Valves, gates, control points. At the center stood a raised stone platform etched with the same symbols he'd seen elsewhere, deeper here, worn smooth by repeated contact. A control nexus. Rowan's training snapped into place. "This is where they stabilize pressure," he said aloud, thinking through it as he went. "Close sections. Redirect flow." Brim climbed onto the platform. The hum shifted. Rowan froze. The dog stood perfectly still, weight centered, paws aligned with the etched lines as if the marks had been made for him specifically. The vibration beneath them eased slightly, the system responding. "Brim," Rowan said, voice tight. "Off." The dog did not move. Rowan stepped closer, scanning the chamber. The valves were manual but old, counterweighted, designed to respond to load and balance rather than switches, designed for animals. Rowan's jaw clenched. He reached for Brim's harness, fingers brushing the dark red trim. The dog turned his head just enough to meet Rowan's eyes, amber to gray-blue. Oh, there was no panic there, only certainty. Rehook, mid-chapter moment. The tremor surged suddenly stronger, sharper. Rowan staggered as dust rained from the ceiling. Somewhere deeper in the system, stone cracked, not catastrophically, but enough to change the equation. The hum rose in pitch. Brim adjusted his stance instinctively, spreading his weight, muscles locking into place with trained precision. Rowan understood then, with brutal clarity. If Brim stepped off the platform now, the system would fail. Pressure would spike. Sections would collapse. The village, every careful beam and channel, would be lost. And if Brim stayed... Rowan swallowed hard, forcing the thought away. "Stay with me," he said, voice low, steady despite the crack running through it. "Just stay." The chamber shuddered again, then settled into a new rhythm, strained but holding. Rowan moved quickly, mapping the control points with his eyes. He traced the channels, followed the lines etched into stone, searching for an alternative. Had to be redundancy. There always was. He found it along the far wall, a secondary gate, partially concealed, its mechanism jammed with debris shaken loose by the drilling above. Rowan dropped to one knee and set to work, fingers moving with mechanical efficiency. He pried, shifted, leveraged stone against stone. The vibration spiked again. "Almost," Rowan muttered, sweat cutting cold tracks down his spine. Brim remained motionless. Minutes stretched thin as wire. Rowan forced the jam free, and the secondary gate slid into place with a low grinding sound. The pressure redistributed, the hum dropping a fraction. The system was stable. For now. Rowan leaned back on his heels, chest heaving once before he forced his breathing back under control. He looked at Brim. "Good," he whispered. "That's good." The dog did not relax. His stance remained locked, muscles taut, as if he knew what Rowan was still refusing to accept. Above them, on the surface, engines roared briefly, then cut out. The drilling had stopped. Not because of mercy, but because someone had gotten the data they needed. Rowan's hands curled into fists. Gideon Price would call this an accident. Rafe Kellen would log it as a test anomaly. No one would mention the underground system that had nearly been broken open by carelessness or intent. Rowan moved closer to Brim and knelt in front of him, bringing his face level with the dog's. "I'll figure something out," he said quietly. "I promise." Brim's ears flicked, but his body did not move. His eyes never left Rowan's. The system hummed steadily now, but the strain remained, a reminder written into the stone itself. Whatever had been triggered here could not simply be undone. Rowan stood slowly, unwilling to force Brim to move until he understood the full consequence. He scanned the chamber again, committing every detail to memory. This wasn't over. Not the drilling, not the pressure, not the choice forming like a shadow behind his thoughts. Rowan placed a hand on Brim's shoulder, feeling the steady warmth beneath fur and harness. "Hold," he said softly. Brim did. Together, they listened to the mountain breathe harder now, but alive. And Rowan understood, with a clarity that hurt, that silence had already exacted its first cost. Rowan did not sleep. He stayed kneeling beside the control platform long after the system settled into its strained equilibrium, one hand resting against Brim's shoulder, the other pressed to the cold stone floor, as if touch alone might hold the mountain together. Brim remained locked in place. 5 years old. Full grown. Muscles coiled beneath thick fur the color of winter ash and pale cream. His chest rose and fell steadily, breath controlled, trained. The black harness with its dark red trim lay taut across his shoulders, straps biting slightly where his weight bore down against the etched stone. This was not fear. This was duty. Rowan had seen that posture before, on men standing on pressure plates, holding doors, anchoring ropes while others crossed. The kind of stillness that did not ask how long it would last, was only whether it was enough. "I'm here," Rowan whispered, though the dog had not wavered once. The mountain hummed low, steady, wrong. Not the calm breathing of a balanced system, but the forced rhythm of something compensating under stress. Rowan knew that sound. He had heard it in failing generators, in damaged hulls, in structures pushed past the margins their builders had intended. The redundancy he'd activated had bought time. Not safety. Rowan forced himself to stand and move away from Brim, every step an act of restraint. He checked the secondary channels again, then the tertiary nothing left to give. The system was holding because Brim was holding, and because the drilling above had stopped. For now. Rowan climbed back toward the surface alone. The tunnel felt hostile on the ascent, stone walls closing in, air cooling too quickly. When he resealed the entrance and emerged into daylight, the forest hit him like an insult. Bright, indifferent, as alive in a way the underground could not afford to be. The lake was loud with cracking ice. Rowan barely noticed. His phone vibrated again. This time he answered. "Mr. Hale," Gideon Price said smoothly. "I was hoping you'd call." Rowan stared out across the water, jaw set hard enough to ache. "You drilled?" Gideon chuckled softly. "We conducted preliminary sampling, entirely within regulatory allowances. You destabilized something you didn't understand." A pause. Just long enough to be intentional. "Oh," Gideon said, voice warm, amused. "On the contrary, we understand it very well." Rowan's grip tightened on the phone. "We understand," Gideon continued, "that there's something beneath that land which responds to load, pressure, balance. Fascinating design, really. Almost elegant." Rowan felt the words like a blade sliding between ribs. "You knew," he said. "I suspected," Gideon corrected. "You confirmed." Rowan closed his eyes once. "And the dog?" Gideon added casually. "Oh, that part surprised us." Rowan's breath hitched despite himself. "Your German shepherd," Gideon went on. "Extraordinary animal. Loyal. Disciplined. Willing to hold position even when it hurts." The cruelty was not in the words. It was in the accuracy. "What do you want?" Rowan asked. "Cooperation," Gideon replied. "You keep him there. We keep drilling carefully this time. We extract what we need. Everyone walks away compensated." "And when you're done?" Rowan said. Another pause. Gideon smiled on the other end of the line. Rowan could hear it. "Well," Gideon said lightly, "pressure systems fail eventually." The call ended. Rowan stood there, phone dead in his hand, the northern wind cutting through his jacket like punishment. He returned underground at a run. Brim was still there. Still standing. Still holding the mountain together with muscle and instinct and something deeper Rowan refused to name. "I'm back," Rowan said hoarsely. Brim's ears flicked. Nothing else moved. Rowan dropped to his knees in front of him, hands gripping the harness now, forehead pressing briefly against the dog's chest. He could feel the strain in every breath Brim took, the micro-adjustments in stance as the system pulled and pushed against him. "I won't let him do this," Rowan said. "I swear." He reached for the pack and pulled out the last thing he had avoided using. A small steel jack, compact, built for controlled lift in confined spaces. He positioned it carefully beneath a secondary plate adjacent to the platform. If he could transfer even part of the load... The tremor spiked. Stone groaned overhead. Brim's body shuddered once, just once, then steadied again. Rowan froze. Slowly, he became aware of something else. New vibrations, sharper, more localized. Not deep drilling this time. Directional. "They're moving closer," Rowan whispered. The system screamed now, not audibly, but through pressure and heat and stress written into the walls. As the jack slipped half an inch, Rowan reset it, hands slick with sweat. Brim made a sound then, not a bark, not a whine. A low, breathless sound that tore straight through Rowan's chest. "No," Rowan said. Don't do that." Brim's eyes met his again. Still calm, still clear, but tired now. The platform cracked. A hairline fracture split the etched stone beneath Brim's front paws, glowing faintly with heat as pressure surged unevenly through the system. Rowan's heart slammed against his ribs. If that plate failed, Brim would fall, and the system would collapse with him. And Gideon Price knew it. Rowan moved without thinking. He braced his shoulder against the jack and forced it upward, every muscle screaming as the load transferred fraction by fraction. Stone protested. Metal shrieked. "Hold," Rowan whispered. "Just a little longer." Brim's legs trembled now, strain finally breaking through discipline. His breathing grew shallow, faster. Above them, engines roared again. Rowan felt it then true panic, cold and absolute. "Gideon!" Rowan shouted into the empty stone. "You win! You hear me? You win!" The drilling stopped. Silence followed, thick and deliberate. Then the vibration returned, stronger than before. Not sampling. Extraction. "They're killing it," Rowan said aloud, horror blooming in his voice. "They're killing it on purpose." The jack slipped. Rowan lunged, catching it with his body, taking the load into his spine and legs. Pain flared, white-hot, but he did not let go. Brim collapsed to one knee, then another. "No, no, no, no!" The platform gave way. Not catastrophically. Just enough. The system failed in sections, pressure cascading in controlled destruction rather than explosion. Stone buckled. Channels ruptured. Rowan was thrown back as the mountain finally exhaled. Dust filled the chamber. The hum died into silence so sudden it rang. When Rowan dragged himself upright, coughing, ears ringing, and the control platform was shattered, and Brim lay on his side beside it. Rowan crawled to him, hands shaking, every breath a plea. "Brim," he whispered. The dog's chest rose once, then again, slower. His amber eyes found Rowan's, unfocused now, pain clouding the calm that had defined him. "You did good," Rowan said, voice breaking. "You did everything right." Brim's tail twitched weakly against the stone. The mountain was quiet now. Too quiet. Brim exhaled a long, soft breath and did not draw another. Rowan stayed there long after the dust settled, arms wrapped around the still warm weight of his dog, forehead pressed to fur gone slack beneath his hands. Gideon Price had not pulled the trigger. He had simply decided the cost. Rowan buried Brim at the edge of the cavern, near a stone wall etched with older symbols of balance and stewardship. He used his hands when tools felt wrong, stacking stone carefully, deliberately. No marker, no name. The mountain knew who lay there. As Rowan stood alone in the silence, Brim had died to protect. Something hardened inside him, something cold and immovable. This was no longer about land, no longer about systems. Gideon Price had crossed a line that could not be negotiated, and Rowan Hale, who had once walked away from war, understood with terrifying clarity that this one had just begun. The mountain did not echo. After Brim's last breath, there was no answering sound, no settling groan of stone, no sympathetic shudder. Just silence, dense and complete, like a held judgment. Rowan stayed where he was, knees numb against the cold floor, hands still wrapped around fur that had already begun to cool. He counted breaths that weren't there anymore because his body needed something to do that didn't break. He did not cry, not because the pain wasn't enough, but because it was too exact. Rowan had learned long ago how grief behaved when it had nowhere to go. It didn't rush. It arranged itself. It took inventory. It built a shape you could live inside if you had to. He finished the burial with care that bordered on ritual. Each stone was placed with intention, not haste. He whispered nothing over the cairn, because words felt like an intrusion. The mountain knew what Brim had done. That was enough. When Rowan finally turned away, his body moved with a calm that felt almost unnatural. He catalogued the damage as he climbed back toward the surface. The ruptured channels sealed by collapse, the control nexus destroyed beyond repair. The village would not be accessed again. Not by him, not by anyone. That, too, felt intentional. Outside, the day had shifted toward afternoon. Light filtered through clouds in long, pale bands. The lake lay open now, ice retreating to the edges as if winter itself had decided to step back. Rowan sealed the stone seam one last time. He did not look back. Town moved on the way towns always did, slowly, stubbornly, pretending nothing had changed. Marin found him at the edge of the dock near dusk. She had removed her ranger jacket and wore a plain sweater beneath, sleeves pushed up, some forearms marked by old scars and fresh worry. Her hair, usually pulled tight, had escaped into loose strands around her face. "You were underground," she said. Rowan nodded. Her eyes flicked to the empty space at his side. She did not ask the question that rose there. Instead, she exhaled once, sharp and controlled. "They've pulled the survey teams," she said. "Packed up before noon. Price Meridian issued a statement about unforeseen instability." Rowan watched the water. He got what he wanted. Marin's mouth tightened. Data, maybe, but not access. Not permits. Not anymore. She hesitated, then placed a folded document on the weathered boards between them. Environmental injunction, emergency classification. Etta's analysis did the trick, plus a few things Theo dug up about Price's last 3 projects. Rowan did not touch the paper. Marin studied him more closely now. "Rowan, what did it cost?" He met her gaze. The answer sat in his chest, solid and unmovable. "Everything that mattered," he said. She nodded once, eyes shining but steady. "Then we finish it." The hearing took place 2 days later in a municipal building that smelled of old varnish and burnt coffee. Gideon Price arrived exactly on time. He looked unchanged tailored suit, measured smile, the same polished composure that suggested nothing could touch him without permission. He took his seat with casual confidence, crossing one ankle over the other as if this were a negotiation, not an accounting. Rowan sat across the room. He wore the same worn tactical shirt, the same boots, the same old watch scratched thin by years that had taken more than they gave. His face was clean-shaven, his posture still. If Gideon noticed him, he gave no sign. Testimony unfolded like process always did, technical, restrained, framed in language that dulled the edges of truth. Etta spoke first, her voice precise, and her gaze sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. She laid out geological data that made extraction untenable. Theo followed, methodical and relentless, introducing documentation that suggested Price Meridian's pattern of accidental destabilization was anything but. Gideon listened with mild interest. Then it was Rowan's turn. He did not bring notes. He did not bring photographs. He brought presence. When he stood, the room quieted, not because he demanded it, but because his stillness did. He did not look at Gideon at first. He addressed the panel, voice even. There was a system beneath that land, Rowan said. Built to endure. Balanced. Responsive. It failed because pressure was applied without care, without understanding, and without consent. Gideon smiled faintly. Rowan turned to him then. You knew, Rowan said. Not accusation. Statement. You knew what would happen if you pushed. Gideon inclined his head slightly, and risk is inherent in progress. Rowan nodded. So is responsibility. He said nothing else. He didn't need to. The room held the weight of what remained unsaid. As the panel recessed, Gideon caught Rowan's eye across the room. For a brief instant, the smile vanished. What remained was calculation, and something like uncertainty. It was the first time Rowan saw it, and it told him everything. The ruling came swiftly. Emergency protections were enacted. Permits revoked. Price Meridian faced investigations that would take years to unwind and fortunes to survive. Gideon Price exited the building without comment. Outside, snow began to fall again light, deliberate, as if the season had decided to return on its own terms. Rowan did not follow Gideon. He returned north. The cabin stood as it always had, small, weathered, unremarkable. Inside, the space felt larger without Brim's presence, as if absence had weight and volume. Rowan moved through the rooms slowly, touching familiar objects without purpose. He stopped at the doorway where Brim used to wait. He stood there a long time. That night, Rowan lit the stove and let the fire burn low. He sat on the floor, back against the wall, watching the flames fold into themselves. He felt the grief now, not sharp, not overwhelming, but steady. A companion rather than a wound. Sometime before dawn, he slept. He dreamed of nothing. Spring arrived quietly. The lake cleared. Grass pushed through the last crusts of snow. Rowan repaired the dock where ice had splintered it, working with his hands until the ache felt earned. He walked the trails alone, listening to the forest without asking it to answer. People came by sometimes. Marin, with updates and coffee. Theo, once, to return a book Rowan hadn't known he'd lent. Etta sent a postcard, no words, just a sketch of stone layers drawn in careful pencil. The mountain remained closed. Rowan did not try to open it again. One evening, as the light stretched long and gold across the water, Rowan noticed something new near the edge of the clearing. Not movement arrangement, Stones placed in a rough circle where none had been before. Not a marker, not a message, acknowledgement. Rowan knelt, fingers brushing the cool surface. He felt no vibration now, no hum, only earth, resting. Good, he murmured. He stood and turned back toward the cabin, the lake at his side, the forest ahead. The world had not become kinder. It had not become just. But something had been held. Something had been protected. And in that quiet, Rowan found the shape of a life he could still live, not untouched by loss, but guided by it. Brim was gone. What remained was responsibility, and Rowan would not set it down. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder or fire. Sometimes they come quietly, through a loyal heart that refuses to move, through a man who chooses to protect instead of profit, through a place that survives because someone listened when walking away would have been easier. If God still speaks to the world, he does not always shout. Often he whispers through conscience, through sacrifice, through love that asks for nothing in return. And when we are trusted with something fragile, something sacred, the miracle is not that it is saved, but that we are changed by the responsibility to guard it. In our daily lives, we may never be asked to hold a mountain together, but we are asked to hold smaller things, our integrity when no one is watching, our compassion when the world rewards indifference, was our faith when the outcome is uncertain and the cost feels too high. If this story touched something in you, perhaps it is not coincidence. Perhaps it is a reminder that even in a loud and hurried world, God still works through quiet courage and steadfast love. If you believe in stories like this, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what part stayed with you. Subscribe to the channel so we can continue telling stories that matter. May God bless you, protect your path, and grant you peace both in the places you understand and in the ones still waiting to be revealed.